as the Master of Ceremony to this morning event. I am Muhammad Bahrul, a lecturer at the University of Jember Faculty of Law. I'm delighted to welcome the speaker, Jane Ahls, PhD, from the University of New England, the moderator, Igede Widiana Suwada, PhD, from the University of Jember, and Dean of the University of Jember Faculty of Law, Dr. Bayu Dwi Anggono, and all the participants joining this virtual meeting, international public lecture entitled Navigating Ethical, Legal, and Commercial Constraints in the Australian and Indonesian Media. Before we start meeting, let us honor this event with Indonesia Raya, Indonesian national anthem, and followed by hymn UNED. Then we turn to welcoming remark by Tin, Dr. Bayu Dwi Anggono. We would like to request the Dean to open the event officially.
Thank you, Badul Ulum, as a master ceremony. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh, and good morning. Selamat pagi. The Honorable Jane Alston, PhD, Lecturer of School of Humanities, Art and Social Science, University of New England, as the speaker. Igede Widiana Suwarda, PhD, Head of Department of Criminal Law, Faculty of Law, University of Jember, as moderator. Lecturer of Faculty of Law, University of Jember. All participants of the International Public Lecture. As the Dean of the Faculty of Law, University of Jember, it is my great pleasure to meet Jane Alston, PhD, from the University of New England, and welcome the participant of International Public Lecture entitled Navigating Ethical, Legal, and Commercial Constraints in the Australian and Indonesian Media, organized by the Faculty of Law, University of Jember. For your information, this international public lecture has been regularly organized by the Faculty of Law, University of Jember since the end of last year in order to improve academic quality and quality of graduates in both undergraduate and postgraduate program. This is in line with the demand of the Ministry of Education and Culture of the Republic of Indonesia in order that the current higher education administration continue to transform to adapt to global development. To inform Jane Alston, University of Jember is a public university in East Java province with 15 faculties and approximately 34,000 students, where around 2,400 students come from the Faculty of Law. For higher education ranks in 2021, based on the rank by Webometric, the University of Jember is in 10th rank of the best university in Indonesia. I think the topic of today's public lecture is interesting because that Indonesia is currently still trying to find a balance point between media freedom in democratic country and demand for news that still uphold respect for the human right of others and the interest of public order. Currently, the Indonesia government is trying to improve the existing regulation, that is the Electronic Transaction and Information Law, regarding insurance for everyone to communicate and share information without violating the right of others to provide protection on person, family, honor, dignity, and good name guaranteed by the Constitution. Considering the situation, an international public lecture on comparison with laws in other countries is needed. By comparing laws in other countries, Indonesian students will gain knowledge of how other countries set their laws. The lecture this time specifically discuss media law and freedom of information. Although comparison of law with other countries can be obtained by studying literature, this kind of direct lecture is still needed because there is direct interaction. For this reason, let us take the opportunity in this international public lecture. I would like to say many thanks to Jane Alsan PhD, whom I hope someday can visit Jember directly, because I know Jane Alsan know well about Indonesia. Widiana Suwarda PhD and the committee for preparing this event. Finally, by saying Bismillahirrahmanirrahim, I officially open this international public lecture. Thank you to the committee and participants. Wassalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Good morning, selamat pagi.
And opening this event. And the last is prayer by Mr. Fiska Maulidianugroho.
Thank you for Mr. Bahrul Ulum. Can you hear me, all the participants?
Yeah.
Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Good morning, selamat pagi, salam sejahtera, and Om Santi Santi Om. First of all, let us praise and thank the presence of Allah Almighty for the abundance of grace and the joy of all of us can still gather. Although only on camera, at least in your place without any barriers at all and in good health. Not forgetting the salawat and greeting we pour out the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, who has brought us out of the dark age to the era of bright light today, namely Islam. May we all get intercession on the end. Amen. Secondly, thanks to our Dean, Dr. Bayu Dwi Anggono, who allowing us to commit and implementing one of arranging the international public lecture. And greetings we also convey to Mr. Jed and the team who always work hard to success in this class, international public lecture. And the Honorable Miss Jane that meet us in this class among of your busy time. At the last one, for the smooth running of the international public lecture this morning, allow me to lead the prayer in a Muslim manner. Please to each one keep the head to bow during praying. Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Allahumma inna nas'aluka salamatan fid dini wal afiyatan fil jasad wasiyatan fil ilmi wa barakatan fi rizqi wa taubatan qabla al maut wa rahmatan indal maut wa maghfiratan ba'dal maut. Allahumma hawin alaina fi syafaratil maut wan najata minan nari wal afa indal hisab. Rabbana atina fid dunya hasanah wa fil akhirati hasanah wa qina adzabannar wa qina adzabannar. Wa sallallahu ala sayyidina Muhammadin nabiyil ummi wa ala alihi washabbihi wa baraka wa salam. Subhana rabbika rabbil izzati amma yasifun wa salamun alal mursalin walhamdulillahi rabbil alamin. Surah Al-Fatihah. A'udzu billahi minasyaitonir rajim. Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Alhamdulillahi rabbil alamin. Ar-Rahmanir-Rahim. Maliki yaumiddin. Iyyaka na'budu wa iyyaka nasta'in. Ihdinas siratal mustaqim. Siratal ladzina an'amta 'alaihim ghairil maghdubi 'alaihim waladdallin. Amin. Amin. Amin ya rabbal alamin. Thank you for all the participants. Good morning. Back to Mr. Barholo. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Fiska, for leading the prayer. Okay, I think this opening session is finished, and we are now continuing to the next agenda, the discussion. And the discussion itself will be handled by Mr. Gede, PhD. So I forward this forum to Mr. Gede as the moderator of this discussion.
Thank you, Arul. Can you hear me, Arul?
Yes.
Good. Good morning, everyone. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Salam sejahtera, Om Swastiastu, Namo Buddhaya, salam kebajikan for all of us. First of all, I would like to express my gratitude to our Dean, Dr. Bayu Dwi Anggono, for the welcoming speech and opening this international public lecture officially, which is a great introduction for the Faculty of Law. Maybe for you, Jane, this is a brief introduction of our faculty. And as my dean mentioned, hopefully you're gonna come to visit us in Jember in the near future. Secondly, I would like to extend my gratitude to our speaker, Jane Alstrand, which is already on the Zoom meeting with us. Thank you very much for accepting our invitation, Jane, and being with us today, this morning in International Public Lecture. So this is a valuable time for you and for us. Actually, for us, it's a very valuable time because we can meet and greet with you, even though it is online meeting, but I think we need to hear from you about your experience in journalism and social media. And then to all the participants, thank you very much for joining this international public lecture, which is hosted by the Faculty of Law, University of Jember. I think the participant is not just only, University of Jember students, but also from some other universities throughout Indonesia. This is really good for us because it's not just for our students, but also for another students in Indonesia as well. Thank you very much again for joining this international public lecture. This one is about, as mentioned by Pak Dekan and also Arul, this is about navigating ethical, legal, and commercial constraints in the Australian and Indonesian media. From the title, I think Jen will explain to us about the comparison between the situation in Australia and in Indonesia. And my name is Igede Widiana Suarda, as part of the Faculty of Law and University of Jember member. I will be hosting and also moderating these sessions. And just a quick note that this international public lecture will be recorded. Please be aware of it. If you have your camera on, make sure you turn it off if you don't want your video to be set for the social media later on. But if you want your video to be set, just turn your camera on. I always ask my students to please turn your camera on because I want to see you. But also we give a choice for the students. If you don't want your video to be set on the social media later on, please turn off your camera. So depending on your decision. For those who don't know International Public Lecture, maybe I will explain a bit about this event because this is the second one to Jane maybe and to all the participants. As Pak Dekan mentioned, we will have this international public lecture regularly. Hopefully we can make it this year, maybe 4 to 5 times this year. We hope that we can make it. And at the end on November, we're gonna host it an international conference. And I hope Jane can join with us in the international conference in November this year, Jane. So give me to say 1 more minute to introduce you, Jane, as the speaker, before I pass it to you. And please, I will share my screen to show to all of you about Jane's background. Wait a second. Arul, can you see my screen, Arul?
Yes, sir.
All right. This is our guest speaker today, Jane Ahls from University of New England, School of Humanities, Arts, and Social Sciences. She is a lecturer at School of Humanities, Arts, and Social Sciences. I know Jane very well since I was studying in QUT in Queensland. She was there as well. So we have long discussion about Indonesian and culture. And she is an Indonesianist, I think, because she have lots of concern with the Indonesian situation, Indonesian culture, and even she can speak Bahasa Indonesia. So if you want to ask her in Bahasa Indonesia, don't hesitate to ask her in Bahasa Indonesia, because I think she can understand Bahasa and she can reply your question in Bahasa Indonesia. So this is a brief education history of Jane. Uh, she got Bachelor of Arts in Asian and International Studies, also Bachelor of Arts in Languages and Applied Linguistics, majoring in Indonesian language, Asian regional studies from Griffith University in 2005. And then she got honors, Bachelor of Arts and in Humanities and Asian Languages, first class honors from Curtin University in 2013. And from University of Queensland in 2019, she got Doctor of Philosophy from the School of Languages and Cultural Studies with the thesis title, A Critical Discourse Analysis of Women, Power and Social Political Change in the Indonesian Online News Media. So that is a brief introduction about our speaker today. Without further ado, Jane, if I missed something to introduce yourself, please introduce yourself if I missed something, so you can add more something about yourself so we understand who you are and what you're doing about something in Indonesia. Very nice to have you today. Without further ado, Jane, and then floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Pak Gede. And thank you everyone for coming along. Thank you for the invitation. I appreciate it very much. I'm getting a bit of echo. Is anyone else hearing an echo?
Nice.
It's okay? All right, it's just me then. Okay, so yeah, as you can see from my education background, I don't specialize in law, and I expect that everyone here in attendance is much more of an expert in law compared to me. But my interest lies in media discourse, so journalism and practices of journalism in Indonesia. And these days, rather than starting out in Australia and then looking to Indonesia, I actually looked to Indonesia first. And now I'm looking back at my own country and the situation that we're facing at the moment. And although, yeah, my area isn't law, I can recognize the real importance of the laws on journalism and media practices in both countries. So I'm going to speak a little bit about that today. And this is just initial research. And as you'll probably recognize, that there's a lot more analysis that can be done. And I think possibly by raising these topics today, you may also start to think about it yourself. You know, what the similarities and differences are between Australian and Indonesian journalism and the laws that influence them. Okay, so I'm going to share my presentation now. Here we are. So yeah, I'm not going to present a whole lot of findings here. It's initial inquiries. So I think, yeah, it reflects my stage in my current research, and as well opens the opportunity to you to ask some questions, develop your own hypotheses and possible hunches that could lead to further research, either as an undergraduate or a postgraduate perhaps. And I think you'll also notice that although we may work in one particular specialization, such as, for example, criminal law, we can always look for opportunities for cross-disciplinary research. And I'm not sure about the case in Indonesia, but that's what they're really pushing hard for in Australia. Do more collaboration, cross-disciplinary research collaboration. That seems to be the future in Australia. And I think by doing that, you can really discover things you may not have noticed if you stayed within your area. As well as that, you can also realize how much you can apply, how much knowledge you already have that has the potential to be applied in other areas that you haven't yet explored. So before I go on, in Australia, we do this. We do an acknowledgement of country. So we acknowledge the Aboriginal people of Australia and the land on which we are on which we're standing, on which I'm working, and on which I'm presenting you today. So UNE values and respects the Indigenous knowledge systems as a vital part of the knowledge capital of Australia. And we recognise the strength, resilience and capacity of the Aboriginal community and pay our respects to the elders past, present and future. So if you ever encounter an Australian presentation, you'll probably notice this. And this is a more recent development in Australian history that we have to be conscious of the traditional owners of the land in Australia. So now, without further ado, I'm going to start talking to you today about the Australian media industry. And I don't assume that you have a lot of knowledge of the Australian media industry, so I'm going to present to you some, basic information here. So in Australia, we have the ABC. The ABC is the Australian Broadcasting Corporation, which is our public broadcaster. The public broadcaster is not a state broadcaster in that it's not directly controlled by the government, where we have to present the message in line with the ruling party. No, it's a public broadcaster that delivers news, public service and entertainment, and is universally available across Australia. And it includes a range of platforms such as TV, online, radio, national and international services. So some of you may have encountered ABC Indonesia, which is the Indonesian arm of the Australian Broadcasting Corporation. But as well as this one very large public broadcaster, we also have a range of commercial media organisations, so including free-to-air TV, streaming services, cable TV, newspapers, radio, and news websites. And all media organisations these days are increasingly moving towards the online platform as a way of spreading information. Unfortunately, in Australia, like probably a number of other countries, you may find some similarities with Indonesia here. We do have an ownership oligarchy happening in this country. So Rupert Murdoch, you may have heard of Rupert Murdoch, and his News Corp or News Corporation owns 64.2% of Australian newspapers. Okay, and we also have a few others like Fairfax Media, Nine West, 7 media. But as a result of this media oligarchy, the limiting of ownership to a few people with extremely high levels of wealth and political influence, it's kind of changing the shape of our commercial news industry. And we're also seeing a decline in media diversity, such as a decline in regional news media. And that's quite a shame in Australia, considering that, you know, a lot of people in Australia live inland and live in rural communities, and they deserve to be represented. It's very easy to forget about rural communities in Australia and focus on the major capital cities. But anyway, that's what's happening here. And here we have Rupert Murdoch, this very powerful man, and he not only controls media organisations in Australia, but elsewhere, such as, you know, India, Germany, the UK, and the US. So I think, yeah, he was quite a strong player, not only in the Australian, securing the Australian elections and influencing votes, but also in the American presidential elections. Okay, so also the media law, when we talk about law, it's regulated by the Australian government. And I'm concerned today quite strongly about the defamation law. So the defamation law in Australia is both a state and federal responsibility when it comes to implementation and enforcement. But in Australia, federal or national law tends to override state law if there's any kind of discrepancy, any kind of differences. We also have the Australian Communications Media Authority that will handle complaints about anything that goes on in the media industry. And as well as that, we have the Australian Press Council, which is more on the side of journalists with the aim of maintaining freedom of the press. Okay, so let's have a talk a bit more about defamation and the balance between the law and freedom of the press in Australia. So organisations should generally demonstrate a commitment to democratic values. I think we can all agree on that, especially the Australian Broadcasting Corporation, as it's not a commercial organisation, so it doesn't have to bow down in any way to its sponsors. However, in Australia these days, unfortunately, defamation cases are becoming ubiquitous. That means a lot more widespread in Australia. And unfortunately, it's also difficult to defend for media organisations. And this is for a number of reasons. There's an uncapped aggravation in the law, which means that if somebody says they've been hurt or upset, there's no limit, you know, so there's no minimum amount of feeling hurt or upset. If you feel upset, aggravated by something that's been published about you, you can sue. As well as that, there's an onus or a responsibility on the media organisation to prove that the content is true. And there's no, at the moment, we have no public interest defence contained in the law to protect journalists, saying that, you know, it was important to report on this rather controversial information that may incriminate this certain individual or group. But in Australia, we can't rely on that as being in the interest of the public. And also there's another reasonable publication defence that doesn't exist. Oh, it does exist, but it's near impossible to prove for the media organisations. And I think as experts in the law, I think you'll find that sometimes the wording of certain laws can be very vague and difficult. And because of that vagueness, they can be very, very difficult to apply. And they can also be easily manipulated by those often in positions of power and influence. So I'm going to give you some examples of that shortly. So, yeah, these days in Australia, we find both citizens and media organisations seeking to hold those in power to account being silenced by our current defamation laws. So my position is that in Australia, in a democracy like Australia, we can and must do better in the development and application of our defamation laws. So here we go back to the ABC. So as I mentioned, it's funded directly by grants from the Australian government, but that doesn't mean it's a state media organisation. It still has independence. It's expected to follow an editorial policy committed to principles, including, as I said, independence, integrity, responsibility, accuracy, impartiality, and diversity and fairness and privacy. So all those things contained in the ABC's principle. And it may not express an editorial stance other than a commitment to the fundamental democratic principles. So democratic principles may be open to interpretation. So since 2013, the centre-right federal government, so we have the Liberal and National Coalition government that is in power in Australia. And our Prime Minister, Scott Morrison, is a part of this centre right-wing kind of government at the moment. And we also have a more left-leaning political parties such as the Labor Party and the Greens, but they haven't been in power for almost, let's say, a decade, almost a decade. So the centre-right government, along with conservative commentators in the media, have accused the ABC of bias. So here are some examples. And they're becoming quite, they're scrutinising the actions of ABC journalists. So rather than having freedom of the press and freedom to raise important issues such as human rights violations or important commitments to democratic principles, they're being constrained. So here's an example. In June 2019, the ABC Sydney headquarters were raided by the Australian Federal Police, so the National Police. So they targeted journalists for their role in reporting on leaked military information on unlawful killings committed by the Australian Army in Afghanistan. I don't know if this story has made it to Indonesia, but back when it first broke, it was such a controversial report that the Australian government, via the Australian Federal Police, attempted to censor it. They actually went to court over this matter, and thankfully, the ABC journalists were found not guilty, and the story was able to be broadcast again in greater detail. And so that led to a great deal of shame and on behalf of the Australian military, and they had to be held to account for these unlawful killings of innocent civilians in Afghanistan. So as you can see, investigative journalism plays an extremely role in holding institutions to account, but at the same time, they can be subject to censorship. We also saw more recently in 2020, the government decided to cut funding to the ABC, which resulted in around 250 job losses and removal of programming on television, radio, and digital platforms. So again, by cutting the money, the funding, it's another kind of form of censorship or a way of silencing them. In recent weeks, we've got a case involving our Australian Attorney General. He's actually no longer the Attorney General since 2 days ago, but he was involved in rape allegations, historical rape allegations. And an ABC journalist, Louise Milligan, wrote about this back when they were still allegations. In her reports, she did a number of reports, she never named the minister involved directly. However, Christian Porter launched a defamation case against her. And as I mentioned before, as we know, the defamation laws in Australia can be quite vague and very, very difficult for the journalists or the media organisation to defend. Christian Porter does seem to have the upper hand. He does have an advantage here. So yeah, these are the characters involved. So this is Christian Porter and Louise Milligan. She's a no-nonsense, very serious journalist, and Christian Porter here is delivering his public, what was he doing? A public denial of any involvement in historical rape cases, any form, because there was more than one story about him. So that's one example here. And I should also mention that in the commercial media and their practices, the Australian federal government hasn't really raised any issues with, for example, ongoing attacks on left-leaning politicians, and in particular, some anti-climate change rhetoric that's been coming out of commercial news media organisations. So the Australian government has chosen to ignore that. So I'll show you some cartoons from the Australian media, because the Australian media is fighting back about these attempts at censoring and the use of the defamation law, or use of the threat of applying the law to their practices. So here we have the Minister of Home Affairs, and this was back during the Afghan files case, and we have the Home Affairs, the Australian Federal Police, ASIO, which is kind of like our national intelligence organisation, and here we have Australian Press Freedom standing there in front of them. You may be familiar with this image if you've learned about the Tiananmen Square. So it may seem to some to be a bit hyperbolic, a bit of an overreaction, but if these kind of things start to happen, and if we start to accept them, then it will become the norm. And the Australian press will be very, very restricted in what they can report on. And here we have another image of making news tonight. No, not that item or that. So we've got the Australian Federal Police controlling whatever we're going to broadcast on the news. So that's our concern. That's where we're at the moment in the Australian media. But looking forward, we do have small rays of hope shining through. So we have our former Prime Minister Kevin Rudd, who started a petition for a royal commission. So a royal commission, I guess, doesn't exist in Indonesia, but it's, let's say, an inquiry, an investigation at the national level, sanctioned by, I think, by the Queen, actually, because Australia is part of the Commonwealth. So a royal commission into News Corporation's domination of the news media. So as I mentioned before, News Corporation is a huge media conglomerate in Australia and has produced reels and reels of biased reports. However, the federal government was doing nothing. It was up to the former Prime Minister from another previous government to launch a petition. And at the moment, we're going to begin a Senate inquiry. So I don't know how we describe the Senate, but it's at a level of in the Parliament to investigate what's going on with News Corporation and their influence on politics in Australia. As well, we may have changes to the defamation law in the works. So in the works meaning in the process, it may be happening. So they will be increasing the strength of public interest reportage. So even if something portrays an individual or a group in a very negative way, and that individual may feel offended or slandered, if it's in the public interest within our democratic society, then the media may be able to rely on it as a defense. So this is a personal thing for me. What I'm thinking of doing, looking at how ABC journalists navigate their commitment to democratic principles under increased scrutiny of the federal government. In particular, I'm interested in how the threat of defamation can impact on the freedom of the press in our democracy. And do the ABC journalists use self-censorship, or do they alternatively display bias against left-leaning political figures so that the current centre-right government is more satisfied with their reporting? So I'm thinking of looking into that, but as well as that, my ideas for the future may involve some comparative research with Indonesia. So I'm thinking possibly some of the issues that are raised in the Australian context may also occur, of course, in different events, but they may also occur in the Indonesian context, possibly. So I'm actually a linguist, so I focus on the language that is used and how the language reflects surrounding political or legal constraints. Okay, so that's my area. But now let's have a look at the Indonesian situation. And I mean, I feel a little bit awkward as an Australian speaking to Indonesians about your media, but this is my understanding. This is what I've developed through my research as part of my PhD, where I studied the Indonesian online media in particular. So let's go back a little bit in history to talk about the Indonesian media under the new order. So I'm sure you're aware for sure that Indonesian journalists operated in a very restricted environment under the new order. And so they had both formal and informal censorship mechanisms. And the Ministry of Information was the main instrument of propaganda and censorship for the government, so controlling what can be published and even how many media organisations are permitted to operate in Indonesia. So the journalists themselves were subject to surveillance and control from the ministry, and here we have media organisations that were deemed too critical of the government, or in particularly the president, faced bans, while individual journalists could be sentenced to prison. So this was happening in an authoritarian regime, which we can understand this is their modus operandi. But we're seeing this happening in Australia, where journalists are publishing a really important public interest story about human rights violations, facing, being raided by the police and then having to go to court and defend themselves. Of course, ABC wasn't banned and the journalists were still able to operate in the end, but it was quite a scary moment in our modern history. As well as that, the Indonesian government with the military enforced, what was allowed to be published. And journalists constantly had to deal with that threat of violence from the military. They could disappear if they reported on sensitive issues, particularly those involving military personnel. So in the new order, Indonesian journalists adopted the practice of self-censorship. So they would have an internal mechanism. They'd know, I shouldn't be reporting on this issue. I know what the consequences will be. And the editors in the newsrooms had to keep an eye on what they were reporting to avoid raising the ire of the New Order elite. So, as well as self-censorship, across a range of forms of cultural expression in Indonesia under the New Order, Indonesians, being very creative, innovative people, managed to develop a way of using language skillfully that could still criticize someone or an institution without being noticed, without being explicit. So that's a survival strategy that Indonesian journalists had to develop. And people reading the news or watching the news or hearing from journalists themselves would know how to selectively listen to a story in order to read between the lines and understand what really was being said. So now we move on to the democratic era. So things, as you know, have changed a lot in Indonesia since 1998. So after Reformasi in particular, the Indonesian media became a very, very vibrant place. Lots of new ideas, images, different voices and opinions were circulating at that time. And there were a lot of new media organisations that suddenly mushroomed at the time. Unfortunately, more recently, journalistic freedom has been a bit constrained by the elite interests. So I mentioned before, in Australia, we're dealing with a media oligarchy. So in Indonesia, media owners and their alliances with businesses and political parties are playing a dominant role in determining what to publish and how to write about it. So here it says 9 business groups control half of the print media and 2/3 of the television stations in Indonesia. So we're seeing a dependent relationship between the media, businesses, and political groups. And at the same time, journalists may want to report on, for example, a corruption story, but they still have to be careful about who they report on and how they report on it. And journalists in Indonesia see themselves as watchdogs, as important players in the democratic era, but sometimes market-driven political aims of media owners tend to dominate the professional goals of the journalist. And one thing I haven't mentioned here as well is the rise of social media. Okay, so these days, with the onset of platform convergence, where a news media article, like a news report, can be read on the website or in a newspaper, but these days they're a lot more commonly read on WhatsApp, on Facebook, or what else do you have? Line, not really Instagram, yeah, Twitter. So this style of media consumption is a lot more rapid fire, a lot more, let's say, superficial, and often interested in polarization or sensationalism. So as well as these, the power of the media owners, we also have the power of the online digital realm in determining the way that news media organizations and journalists publish stories. So let's talk a little bit about defamation in Indonesia. So we've already established that, ownership and platform convergence can influence the way stories are produced and consumed, but we also have restraints on journalism through the legal mechanisms in Indonesia. So we had initial reforms at the beginning of Reformasi guaranteeing press freedom. We've got the new ITE law. And so I don't really need to tell you about what that is. I'm sure you all already know about it, but and it has two versions, the 2008 and the more updated 2016 one. So it contains a provision criminalizing defamation and insult on the internet, and it changed to a petitioned offence in 2016, which means it can't proceed without a petition. However, and this is where we kind of see the similarities, vagueness, and here the vague definition of what constitutes defamation in the law means that it can be used opportunistically against individuals and groups who express critical opinions on the internet and social media. So this also applies to journalists. So it compels the journalists to exercise caution in their reporting. A report from Amnesty International from 2020 said around 119 cases of alleged violations of the right to freedom of expression occurred because of the ITE law. And I think it's really important for us to be aware of this. And Indonesia is still a young democracy. So yeah, we need to pay attention to how this law is structured and how it can be applied. And I think that said, we also need to turn our attention to, let's say, older democracies like Australia, because just because Indonesia is a young democracy and perhaps a little bit more fragile coming out of an authoritarian government, it doesn't mean that Amnesty International cannot turn their attention to the Australian media. I think we need to have a balance in the way that we investigate these violations and don't focus simply on, younger democracies. So what kind of reporting practices do journalists use in Indonesia? And I think you'll find that these practices do apply to other countries. So since Reformasi, the topics have expanded. So they're covering themes like corruption or interpersonal conflict at the elite level, like, I don't know, Megawati and Prabowo or Megawati and SBY not getting along. I don't think that would have happened during the new order, but there's a lot more openness to these kind of themes. However, the way that they write about it still shows evidence of self-censorship. So reports often contain a lack of context, a focus on events rather than underlying causes, and too much privileging of official sources. So the voice of the little people doesn't get heard. So a focus on issues and events rather than underlying causes and consequences is probably a symptom of a lack of ability, or maybe a reluctance to undertake investigative journalism. Investigative journalism can uncover very uncomfortable and painful truths in politics and society, but it also takes a lot of time and money to conduct. And where media is increasingly moving to an online rapid fire realm, I don't see there being a lot of time to engage in investigative journalism in Indonesia. So they're kind of constrained not only by a fear of legal action, but also by these commercial constraints and the deadlines that they have to work towards. So looking at corruption, for example, while there's this newfound enthusiasm for covering it, and I'm sure everybody's familiar with all those really sensational photos we see of politicians wearing the orange KPK vest, being, you know, pushed into the car, the police car, surrounded by a crowd. The cases do tend to be scandalized, like soap operification, like overly dramatic and banal, rather than focusing on the institutional and systematic causes. They tend to identify one person and mark them as the evildoer, and let's all hate this person because they're a corruptor. Whereas instead of looking at how did this person manage to get away with this for so long, okay, and how did they manage to become so powerful? So while drawing attention to corruption and the shame of being caught for corruption can strengthen support for the anti-corruption movement, the superficial coverage undermines democratic political engagement with the issue. And it typifies, it is an example of the dilemma that Indonesian journalists face. So they want to increase the public demand, they want to satisfy increasing public demand for transparency and politically compelling content, but they still remain susceptible to the political interests of their employers as well as the threat of legal action. So yeah, as I mentioned before, you know, these are the kind of images we see in the media and we're like, oh, boo, Ratu Atut, look at her, she's so corrupt. But why was she so corrupt? Need to go a bit more in depth rather than just demonizing the individual. And this is a more recent case, isn't it? Anyway, to finish, I've got some ideas for discussion, some things for you to think about. So in Australia and Indonesia, is there a place for a defamation law in regulating the media? Do you think it plays a role? If so, how would it work, or how should it work? Do you think the changes to the ITE law in 2016 are enough to ensure its integrity? And I've heard about this recently, and I'd like to hear more from you. What role do the virtual police play in Indonesia? I've seen media reports about that. I'm quite curious. And I didn't mention this before, but this is kind of part of the rise of social media and platform convergence. We have the issue of fake news and hate speech perpetuated in the media and in social media. So are there legal ways of regulating it? So what kind of perspective can we take? Someone here has suggested previously using a human rights perspective. And going back to the ABC, do you think the national broadcaster is an important component of a democratic society, or can we live without it? Do we need the ABC? Do we need a national broadcaster in any country? And as I said before, since the new order, the Indonesian journalists have adapted to censorship and developed a way of conveying critical opinions in the press, while audiences and readers have developed a skill in reading between the lines and understanding what the true content is. Do you think that's the case? Do you know how to do that? Or have you heard of this phenomenon happening in Indonesia? And then thinking a bit more about what the consequences of producing and consuming news in an online environment are. So I'll leave those up there, but thank you very much. Terima kasih banyak, yeah. Thank you. Oh, and there's so many questions in the chat I just discovered.
All right. Thank you very much, Jane, for the presentation. It's so informative, and we got many things about Australian media and also Australian law about media law, especially. And you can also explain quite clearly about the situation in Indonesia and as well as about the ITE law. As you
That's good.
mentioned, yes, as you mentioned, now we are in a big debating now about ITE law, whether we should reform the law or just we need a new law, totally new law. It is not just a reform, but a new law which is can handle the problem between freedom of speech in the one side and also to you know to to fight against hate speech and fake news on the other side. That's a big problem in Indonesia. Again, thank you very much, Jin, for the presentation. I think this is really good and informative presentation for us in Indonesia. And you passed to us about some questions about the situation in Indonesia. And I think it's a good idea to take some of them to be a topic for the future research. Thank you, Jen, for sharing with us. And now, yeah, we have about 1 hour because our session must be finished at 11. So it is about 1 hour, and there are many questions on the chat room, as you can see as well. On the chat room, there are 1, 2, 3 participants who already jot down his question. The first is Rizky Panchabudi. Maybe you can see as well, Jane. The
Yes, I'm
first is
having a
Rizky
look now.
Panchabudi. Yep. He asked about, the profession of journalism. As a journalist, it's a bit sensitive occupation. I do agree with this because you can be terrorized or get unpleasant treatments due to news that you reported, especially about sensitive issues. That's all correct about journalists and journalism. And the question is how media like ABC can maintain their credibility in their news that they broadcast to avoid such a thing. This is a really good question because this is really Australian perspective. You can explain more about this. And then the second question, I will read it. This is from Evita Ramadhani. The question is, what is your opinion about media law and the position of the press in Indonesia today? Considering that Indonesian citizen, Indonesian journalists in particular, still do not really understand the limits between the right to freedom of expressions and fake news and hate speech. Yes, this is a really good question as well. And I think it's correlated with the previous question. And the last one, I think 3 questions, Jane, enough for the first session of the Q&A. And now I will continue to the next question from the participant.
I think you're frozen, Pak Gede. I think he's frozen. He'll be back. Possibly.
I'm sorry.
Yeah, you froze. You're back.
I'm sorry because of the signal. I think it's. I'm so sorry about this. I think you can reply to the question first, Jen. 2 questions, and then I will continue to the next question from the participant. Over to you, Jen, please. Yeah.
Yeah, not a problem. So the first question, thank you, Rizky, for your question, and thank you for your interest in the Australian context as well. It's great to see young Indonesian people displaying an interest in their neighbour, just as I'm happy to see Australians interested in Indonesia. So how can media like the ABC maintain their credibility in their news that they broadcast to avoid such a thing like unpleasant treatment and being terrorized. Okay, well, I think one part, I think this is similar to both Indonesia and Australia, is that journalists generally demonstrate solidarity. So I think although it's a very sensitive, risky occupation, journalists also need to be brave. And I think because of that, journalists have a certain sense of pride in their work. And especially if you choose to work for the ABC, a journalist is particularly proud of themselves because they're committed to more pure cause, democratic cause. Whereas if you chose to work for a commercial media station or organization, you may be considered to have, I don't know, be a little bit less morally upright. You may be more subjected to commercial influence. But in general, there is a really strong sense of solidarity among journalists in Australia. So especially among the journalists that are actively committed to maintaining democratic principles by creating a transparent government and holding politicians to account. So making sure politicians take responsibility for their wrongdoings or make sure that they don't do it again. So I think one way of dealing with that unpleasant scrutiny and even harassment is belonging to that journalistic community. Unfortunately, female journalists, women in the media, are subjected to a lot of sexual harassment and sexual slander. So I won't repeat what they say to female journalists, but a woman who speaks her mind, is independent and outspoken, often upsets a more masculine group of people, like wanting to protect masculine interests. So these days, not only do we have quite a robust and strong alliance of journalists, but we have also increasing open discourse about the rights of women in the media. And I think getting messages out there on social media, although social media is a double-edged sword, right? It can be used for good and for evil. But these days, social media has played a strong role in political activism and encouraging us to be more critical of, for example, attitudes towards women or attitudes towards Aboriginal people. So I think, two answers: solidarity and also having a commitment to a coordinated social media effort is a good way to maintain journalists' integrity. Okay, thank you, Rizky. And I'm sure my answer is not the complete answer. There's more to it than that, but those are just two ideas I have at the moment. So right now from Avidya, okay, media law and the position of the press in Indonesia today. Okay. Okay, and then the Indonesian journalists and citizens do not understand the limits between the right to freedom of expression and fake news and hate speech. Okay. Well, I think, unfortunately, I think we can't really blame the individuals for this lack of knowledge. I think the media organizations, these bigger media organizations, they have a lot of freedom or a lot of power, let's say, so they can decide the agenda. And I think regulating the media industry and scrutinizing these organizations will help control the way that they possibly abuse power. Whereas I think my general opinion of Indonesian journalists, I have a lot of respect for them. Your country is so dynamic. Something is always happening in Indonesia, and journalists have to be very brave and very willing to get out there on the field and gather news and report on it very quickly. So I think journalists themselves have a lot of skills and a lot of integrity in Indonesia. But I think one thing that may be lacking is this coordinated media journalist alliance where they support one another and support one another when they take risks. And also a society that recognizes and values journalists is very important. So there's also the issue of citizens maybe not being able to tell the difference between real news and fake news, or lacking some critical thinking skills. You know, when something is shared in a WhatsApp group, people read the headline and go, oh yeah, this must be true, and then share it around. I think there is discussion about encouraging citizens to become more literate, more media literate in Indonesia. But I think that focusing only on media literacy is only dealing with part of the problem. I think there is a general reluctance to be there's still a general reluctance in Indonesia to be overly critical, or to be, sorry, just a second. Sorry, I'm talking a lot. So there's a general reluctance to voice a critical opinion and say, hang on, what this doctor says or what this expert says doesn't sound right to me. And then not just being anti something, but actually thinking deeply about why something might be wrong. And rather than just saying, oh, I don't believe in vaccination. We get this problem in Australia too. But actually engaging in critical thinking, not just media literacy, but encouraging critical thinking as part of education is an important thing. Okay. And I think there's a third question, right? Pakade?
Yes, please, Jen. There are two more questions from the participants, from Arisaki and three more. Oh, sorry, four more questions. Sorry, Jen. Just like, let's have a look from Harisaki, but we can make like a cluster for those questions. From Harisaki and from Abdul Rauf is quite similar about ownership oligarchy, as you mentioned about. Maybe you can explain more to Rauf and Saki about ownership oligarchy, which is a problem now in Indonesia, and I think in Australia as well, because the politician, they also rich people and also owner many corporates. So this is a problem in Indonesia, and they ask about how to solve this kind of issues, because this is, like you said, this has already happened, and when we accept it and it will become a norm, that's a big wave of problem for our humanity and our freedom of expression, or freedom of press and freedom of speech as well. So how to deal with this situation? I think that's the question from Harisaki and Abdul Rauf. So the last question is from Sulhirdan Siregar from Batam, I think. He asked about the case related to the media, does Australia also restorative justice in its legal problem? This is a bit out of context, but maybe you can explain a bit about restorative justice because you work with the indigenous as well. I think you can mention a bit about, yeah, restorative justice in Australia. And also there is a question from Sufi, but it is really legal perspective because he asked about how regulation control over the freedom and the media sector. I think this is a legal question. You don't need to reply it, but if you want to say something about Sufi's question, you can also reply Sufi's question, Jane. And to all the participants, we have 30 more minutes. If you have a question and you want to deliver your question directly to Jane, you are pleased to deliver your question directly to Jane. Just raise your hand and I will pass it to Jane. And also you can ask your question in Bahasa Indonesia. I think Jane can understand Bahasa Indonesia, and then also she can reply in Bahasa Indonesia as well. All right, Jane, you can maybe try to mapping the questions and then reply to the questions. But again, if really legal perspective, you can avoid it and then we can discuss it. We have a
Okay.
big discussion about this.
Yeah, you can
Thank
probably
you.
teach me something as well about the legal side of things. Hang on, I just need to shut my curtain. The sun's coming in to my face.
No,
Okay,
no
that's
problem.
better. All right, so I think the first question was about how to deal with the media oligarchy, the media ownership. Well, I wish I knew, because I'd tell you, and we could probably live in a better world. And but I think possibly one of the solutions is to encourage independent media and also small scale media. So it doesn't have to be a newspaper, but I think it can also be in an online format. So having governments committed or allocating some of their budget to supporting smaller independent media organizations is a really important way of adding more vibrancy and more voices to the media landscape in the country. And I'm not sure these days, who knows what might happen in future, because young people may not always get their news from the main sources. They may get it from a secondary source, such as through Facebook or through Twitter. And having those platforms also regulated would be a good way of ensuring that these media oligarchs are not simply pushing a single narrow view. So what I saw in America and Twitter's response to what Donald Trump was tweeting, and certain articles that are being shared that which have contents that are still being debated. So they're being flagged on Twitter increasingly. So I think that's a step in the right direction. And by marking these flags, encouraging readers or users of Twitter, for example, to read the article before sharing. Do you actually agree with the content, or did you just read the headline? That's another way of encouraging citizens to be more actively engaged and activate their critical thinking skills when it comes to encountering the media. And I'm actually quite proud of our former Prime Minister. So, I mean, our former Prime Minister, Kevin Rudd, had his problems, and he ended up not being so popular in the end. But since he's left politics, he has really displayed a commitment to creating greater freedom of the press and a healthier media ecology in Australia by first launching the survey about the domination of News Corp in Australia, and now achieving a Senate inquiry. So I think having certain powerful figures who may not be directly involved in politics at the moment, remaining actively engaged in the media environment after they leave politics is a really good way to hold these current media organisations to account. So those are some ideas. And now I think the next one was about restorative justice. Is that correct?
Yes, it is.
Okay.
Yes, it is applied whether or not a restorative justice if there is a case about, about a media and maybe conflict with the government or conflict with the society itself. As I mentioned, it's about freedom of speech or hate speech. It's a bit difficult to make a decision whether this is a freedom of speech or this is a hate speech. It's quite difficult to differentiate. So there is a case in Australia where the restorative justice is applied, because in Indonesia we didn't see about this idea being applied. And as you mentioned as well, now cyber media, have plenty of followers, and also the government take position to introduce virtual police on the other hand. So it's kind of, yes, it's kind of, face to face against the government and the society. So it's a bit difficult, and it's a big issue in Indonesia. So whether restorative justice is applied in Australia in the media cases, what do you think about it, Jane?
Well, I'm sorry, I'm not really an expert in this area actually, but I can say that the media has, I think somebody needs to mute their microphone. So I think the news media these days has played some role in activating or encouraging or prompting restorative justice. Okay, so I'm not sure if I'm on the right track here, but a few years ago, the ABC, the good old ABC, reported on youth detention. Okay, so the detention of people under the age of 18, and also there were cases of a young Indonesian, a youth under 18 who was arrested on a fishing boat in Australian waters and was imprisoned for people smuggling. But he was just a young guy caught up in the whole issue. But the ABC brought attention to this issue, and because of the ABC's role in that, he was eventually freed. If the ABC journalist hadn't investigated this situation, he may still be in jail. So I'm sorry if that's not exactly restorative justice, but another example is in the Northern Territory, they have quite a big problem with young people being incarcerated, and the majority of these young people are of Aboriginal descent. So an investigative report, again by the ABC, revealed footage, images and video recordings of these young people being locked in their cell, and almost what would constitute torture or a human rights violation. And so when that was shown on the TV, when we're confronted with these images, it prompted an inquiry into juvenile detention in Australia. And I can't say that all the problems have been fixed, but it's a very painful situation and a painful part of a very painful narrative for Aboriginal people. and their experience with the justice system in Australia. So because of these important reports being put into the public domain, it shines a light on injustices affecting vulnerable people. So that's maybe as close as I can get to answering that one about restorative justice. But I can also talk a little bit about hate speech in Australia, and the fine line possibly between freedom of speech and hate speech. I think some people assume that freedom of speech means you can say whatever you want, okay? And that's what freedom is, doing what you want. But freedom of speech is using your speech to create a society that is free and inclusive for everyone. So when it comes to hate speech, you can't just assume that hate speech is a result or allowable within the parameters of freedom to speech, or freedom of speech. And in Australia, I think the parameters or society's moral values differ around the world. And Australia has been changing a lot in the last, let's say, 2 decades to become a lot more inclusive for members of the LGBT community. So now people are able to get married. So same-sex marriage is legal in Australia. So that's a reflection of the changes that our society has gone through, and it's reflected in the legal system. Some people in Australia still do not support it, but we had a referendum. Anyway, we had a very famous sports person, rugby player called Israel Folau. And so Israel Folau is a extremely famous and well-respected rugby player. And it was reported in the media that Israel Folau was posting things on his Instagram that were very anti-LGBT. So, and then there was a big debate about whether or not he as an individual has freedom of speech, freedom to say that gay people should go to hell, or if that constitutes hate speech. Okay, are they discriminating against certain members of society? So that was last year, and the media became a really important platform for those kind of debates. There's no definitive answer there that came out of it, but I think having this debate and having this discussion facilitated by the media is a really good way of functioning as a healthy democracy. Okay, so yeah, the media can play a key role in these debates. But yeah, I'll still go back to my original point about freedom of speech and hate speech being, there's not a fine line. They're actually completely different. They're opposite. They're each other's opposite. So if you want to hate against a minority, a vulnerable minority, for example, in Australia, some people voice hatred towards Asians. So that's not their right as part of freedom of speech. And our constitution doesn't actually guarantee freedom of speech. We are more committed to what's called, democratic principles rather than freedom, which is more of an American concept anyway. So I think I've exhausted myself. Thank you so much for your questions. Are there any more?
Thank you, Jen. It's a really clear explanation how to differentiate between hate speech and freedom of speech. That's really nice to hear from you about this issue, Jen. Actually, we have one more questions. Then we're gonna close this Q&A session. Before we close, there is one more question from Rizky Pancabudi. he raised his hand to ask the question directly to you, Jane. Maybe
Okay.
I can please Rizky Pancabudi to ask the question directly to Jane. Feel free if you want to say in Bahasa Indonesia, just speak in Bahasa. If you want to speak in English, you can speak in English because we're going to move forward about internationally environment in Jember particularly. You can speak English or even you want to speak in Bahasa, you want to say in Bahasa Indonesia, you're pleased to say in Bahasa. Please, Rizky Pancabudi.
All right, thanks for the time. In the slide that said that ABCs is funded by the government, but it's not national broadcaster. In that
Yes. Yes, it's
case,
actually
I was thinking that
funded by the government and it is the national broadcaster, but it's not a state broadcaster.
in that case, how can we judge by that the media is the owned by the government? Thanks for the time.
Okay, yeah, I think that's an important question, and I think that's something that the current Australian government really needs to think about. They need to be able to tell the difference between what is a state media organisation and what is a national media organisation. So a state media organisation is not only funded, but completely controlled by the government. So that's more something you would see in a dictatorship like North Korea. I don't know, where else can I think of? Okay, well, anyway, so the contents of those media reports basically reflect directly government ideology, whereas a national broadcaster is often part of a democratic society deliberately created as an antidote or an antithesis of commercial media. So the national broadcaster has a set of principles which are up here on the screen. So they're expected to be independent. They also maintain to be responsible, accurate, impartial. So having a certain set of values committed to, let's say, good quality democratic journalism. So I guess if they started suddenly aligning themselves with, I don't know, the views of Coca-Cola or Tesla and somehow receive secret funding from them, that would be a complete violation of their principles. So the purpose of having a national broadcaster is, to provide the public with as objective and as quality news as possible, where the journalists have to abide by these guidelines. Whereas if we have a commercial TV station, the news reports may reflect bias towards their sponsors. So, for example, during COVID, during the pandemic in Australia, we have a very, very rich business owner, Harvey, as part of the Harvey Norman Group, who made so much money because of the pandemic selling electronic things. So his store did so well all across Australia. And Harvey Norman is a sponsor for example, Channel 7. So Channel 7 News would never ever portray anything negative about this Harvey guy. They would sometimes mix up commercial stories with actual news. So that was a violation, really. But as you can see, these commercial news organizations are much more susceptible to their sponsors and the influence and expectations that come with giving them money. So I think that explained it. But the Australian government now really needs to keep in mind that just because you give them ABC money doesn't mean that the stories are going to be 100% positive about the current government. If the current government does something wrong, the country should know about it. That's the responsibility of the ABC, actually. So yeah, thank you very much, Rizky, for your question.
Thank you very much, James, for the explanation. I have one question for you, Jane. A bit curious for me because last time I was discussing with my colleague in Australia, and she said that when media doing wrong, they would not get, prison sentence, meaning that they do not send to jail, just got fined. Is that true? Because in Indonesia, according to Indonesian law, if they break the law, they do send to jail. They face jail if they break the law. So a bit
Does that
curious
still
for
happen in
me whether in
Indonesia?
Australia. Yeah, please, Jane.
Wow. Okay.
And also maybe you can
I'm really,
also
yeah.
close your closing statement. Yeah, we want to hear also your
Okay.
closing statement before you reply my questions, and I will pass it to the master of ceremony. I think you reply my question and also make some closing statement for all of us to all the participants.
Okay. Well, okay, I'll answer your question first. So it's still at the top of my mind. Firstly, I'm really saddened to hear that Indonesian journalists can still go to jail because of what they report on. That's, to me, that's a real tragedy, and it's quite concerning for the future of Indonesia's democracy if the consequences of violating some of these media laws or the defamation law are so serious that they go to jail, then that's a threat, and that will prevent journalists taking risks and being bold and brave enough to report the truth. Because I think underlying all journalists is a commitment to the truth. Yeah, so in Australia, no, I haven't heard of any journalists actually going to jail for that. They have been fired, basically, so fined, and they lose their job. And I guess there's a degree of public shame associated with that. So we had this old radio broadcaster, this very, very conservative, right-wing, racist person. But eventually he was fired, and so he's no longer allowed to broadcast on the radio or probably any media organisation, not because of him being racist for like 30 years of his career or sexist. No, it was because he was receiving cash for comment. So he was getting sponsorship from various businesses. And while that's a normal part of commercial media, he was being way too explicit in his support for these businesses. So instead of reporting on or maybe even while he reported on a news story, he would find a way to weave in mention of the products provided by the business or the businesses that sponsored him. So he became quite arrogant. He thought he could get away with that, and he was becoming so wealthy. But eventually, it all started again with the ABC raising this issue and bringing it to the public's attention. And once it's in the public domain, then the responsibility is on the media corporation to do something about it. And unfortunately, these days with our government, our current government, I'm going to be a bit critical here, their approach to any issues that the ABC raises in the public domain is to ignore them until they go away. And people are getting a little bit sick of that. And so there's a lot more, I think there's a lot more anger in Australian society at the moment directed towards the government. because of their lack of action. So that's the Australian situation. And basically, to conclude, I'm so thrilled that you attended my presentation and asked some really great questions that showed that you really engaged with the issues I raised. I apologize. I'm sorry if there was still, I couldn't answer all the questions or the content of my presentation wasn't complete yet, but these issues that I've raised, I think at least have shown the parallels, the similarities between Australia and Indonesia as a democracy, and our mutual commitment to the importance of a free press and a committed alliance of journalists in Australia and Indonesia who dare to report the truth, despite all the constraints that they face. So thank you very much. Terima kasih banyak.
Thank you very much, Jane. Terima kasih banyak as well. You explained so clearly your presentation and you reply very well to all the presenters. I got the point actually. And I can say, Jane, maybe correct me if I'm wrong, there are some similarities and also some differences between Australian media and Indonesian media at the moment, the situations. But overall, we can say that media is in a big problem nowadays because of the technology, I think. So again, Jane, thank you very much for your valuable time, your presentation, and also your knowledge and experience you share with us. This is really, really important for us in Indonesia to understand about the situation in Australia. And as the moderator, I would like to say thank you to all the participants over there, which is my students, mostly my students, but some of them, they are outside from the University of Jember. Thank you very much for joining with us. And also thank you very much for the Dean for supporting us, for supporting the team of International Public Lecture. Hopefully we can, invite Jane to come to Indonesia because, I'm so thrilled to see you in Indonesia, Jane, and can, discuss many, many issues in Indonesia. And the last is, I would like to say sorry as well for the inconvenience to Jane and to all the participants. Meeting online is always on trouble. So I'm so sorry, Jane, for the inconvenience. And again, thank you very much. I close this Q&A session and I pass to Arul as the master of ceremony to close this international public lecture. Stay healthy, Jane. Thank you very much.
You
And
too,
see you
everyone.
in Australia
In
or in
Jember.
Indonesia.
Yep, either one.
Yes, thank you, Jane. Please, Arul. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Akade. Dear participants, thank you for your attendance, and particularly our speaker, Jen Alstrand. Thank you for the presentation this morning. And I want to remind the participants that miss the attendance questionnaire, please see the chat box to fill the questionnaire. And we expect that the participants to fill it to provide a feedback for the committee so that we expect the future international public lecture will be improved. And for those who want to get the presentation file, please visit the link that I already updated in the chat box, or just refer to our official website of the University of Jember Faculty of Law. We upload the video file and also the presentation file. And lastly, we thank to all the participants that currently we have still a large number of participants that's still online, and we will update our future international public lecture on our official website and on our social media. And the certificate will be sent shortly, and we hope by this day or tomorrow. So make sure that the email that you fill is correct. And thank you, and see you in the next international public lecture, in the third international public lecture. And you can leave the Zoom meeting and